Welcome to It's a Good podcast. My name is Hayden.
I'm Chris.
I'm Harry.
And yeah, we're just a bunch of guys having talks about theology, the Bible, and God. And basically our whole goal is just to be accessible to anyone, that you don't need a theology seminary degree to be able to talk about God. We want to make it easy and simple.
I definitely don't have any of those degrees.
Yeah.
That's so true, though. I mean, you just have to be interested in it. All the information's out there.
Let's get into this.
Yeah. So we are continuing our series on who is Jesus, and we are asking that question via the lens of Paul right now. We've done Thessalonians was the first one, and then Galatians.
Galatians.
Right?
Pretty sure it's pronounced that way, you know.
Galatians. And now we are to the Corinthians, to which there are two letters written.
One of the things, there might be 3 letters.
What?
Depending on how you split up 2 Corinthians. So
we'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah.
Interesting. Let's give a little history on the Corinthians and Paul. So their story basically happens, Paul going to Corinth and him meeting the people there, happens in Acts 18, verse 1, just right at the beginning. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. Ta-da! That easy. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Well, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever noticed that little,
Wait just a second here.
Yeah, it's like he found a Jew who was there who had to leave Italy because Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So not a new problem for Jews.
And something that's kind of been a theme in the letters, these people are persecuted. They're persecuted people.
Yep.
Well, and not even for being Christians.
No, this
for
is
being Jews.
Yeah.
For not being Romans.
That's really interesting. Paul came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them while they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. So he's making tents. He meets this guy and his wife, and they become good friends while they sit and chat and make tents together. And then, like he always does, Paul begins reasoning at the synagogue every Sabbath and tries to persuade people to become Christians. And then some stuff happens, and it's not all the best, but Paul decides that he'll stay in Corinth, and it says that he stays here for 1 year and 6 months. So Paul spends a decent amount of time in Corinth and has already made like 2 really good friends in Priscilla and Aquila.
I always said Aquila. That's just me. Who knows?
I mean,
it might be Paul for all we know.
Yeah, exactly.
Paulo.
So that's where this happens. He spends a lot of time in Corinth. And Corinth at this time is kind of, I equate it to like the Las Vegas of the time, where it was a port city that like blew up just like overnight, basically. And so all these young money people are like coming in, and it basically just turns into like Party Town, USA. But it's Party Town, Corinth. So that's the setting where this letter is happening.
I also, from the outside in perspective, which I like to give sometimes, this is what I would call like one of the more famous letters, right?
Yeah.
It's called out a lot, 1 Corinthians, specifically the love chapter. You know, when you're at weddings, it's talked about all the time. Like I just was familiar with it without ever reading it due to how I think famous it is in culture.
I think Hayden did a good synopsis. I'd say like he does spend a bit of time there, and then he writes, I think, from Ephesus back to the Corinthians. And generally, 1 Corinthians is a lot of really positive things. He even opens it up really positively, like we'll talk about. And then 2 Corinthians is more disappointment. We'll talk about 2 Corinthians when we get into it. But 1 Corinthians, he talks about coming back to visit. And then that happens at some point. And then you get 2 Corinthians where he talks about it not being a great visit.
The letter of 1 Corinthians is kind of divided into 5 parts, and it's 5 issues that the church is having. So he's been there, he's been preaching the gospel, he's done it for 1.5 years. A bunch of church communities, or at least a few church communities, have formed there, and they seem to be going well. So Paul heads on out, and then he gets reports that they're having major issues in the church, particularly in at least 5 categories that he addresses throughout the letter. First one is there are factions in the church. That's the part where it's chapters 1 through 4 where they're like,
They're divided. Yep.
yeah, they're like, I follow Paul.
I follow Apollos. I
Yeah.
follow Cephas, and another.
Yeah.
I follow Christ.
Yep,
Mhm.
exactly.
Really cool though, because he starts the debate it right from the beginning, because he says to the church in Corinth, which is like is everybody.
Mhm.
Like it's not one specific church he's writing to. He's writing to everybody in Corinth.
Mhm. Well, and
He's already calling them out as a like, hey, like you should be unified.
yes, that's exactly what I was just going to say. It's smart that he starts off with this issue because, hey, at the tip of the pyramid,
That's
we
true.
need to be unified. Like all these other issues pale in comparison to us being unified under Christ.
Agreed.
And
Yeah.
I mean, once again, let's take it to 2019. How many divisions? We got Methodists, we got Lutherans,
growing,
we got
man.
yeah. There's so many different ones.
As far as Protestant, denominations go, they're growing.
Paul would be like, "You guys are stupid. Like, why don't you just call yourself Christ followers or whatever it might be?"
I think we shouldn't be separating ourselves based on small things, but at the same time, if you can stay unified, but say have churches that address everything,
Yeah.
like, I think that's okay.
So I think that I could eat dinner with you
Yeah.
even if you were allergic to gluten, right? We
Yeah.
could still sit down and we could eat dinner.
Yeah.
I think we've taken it way, way farther than that.
Yeah.
And I know that I've heard a lot of people speak, knowledgeable Christians out there, like deeply disturbed at just how many divisions there are, as well as how deep those divisions are.
Yeah.
It prevents, metaphorically, you and I from having dinner with each other.
Right.
You know?
Like I think it's really messed up when people's identity is in their denomination and not in their religion.
That's
Like,
a really good way to put it.
First and foremost, you should be a Christian.
Mhm.
Like you follow Christ. Obviously, no matter what we do, we're going to have divisions, but first and foremost, that's how you should identify yourself, and you should be able to get along with anybody else that says they follow Christ.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is kind of ironic that we have the same exact issue now where it's like, I follow Wesley or I follow Luther,
Yes.
or, and it's like literally those are
Yes.
the primary over I follow Jesus.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, I've experienced that in my own time being at various churches. So, I
It's
mean,
frustrating.
as far as practical application goes, I mean, we haven't even started really, and we already have a practical application,
Yeah.
which is, it's fine. And Paul later on, he's like, be imitators of me as I am imitators of Christ. So it's
Right.
not like he's saying, don't care about me and my specific teaching at all.
Mhm.
He finds his own role modelship like a good thing to follow. And so it's like, hey, if you really connect with Luther in the way that he talks, great, like follow him, but it's because he's an imitator of Christ.
Right.
Like ultimately that's your goal.
That's the depth chart, like you
Yeah.
said. First and foremost, Paul is saying you should follow Christ. And he's saying, who is Christ? He should be number one in your book. God and
Yeah.
Christ, the triune, they should be number one. Everything else after that, like for sure. Like if you find a good person, if Mother Teresa is somebody that I want to identify with, I should emulate her. But first and foremost, I should emulate Christ.
Yeah, and I can't speak for everybody that people follow, but I'd say the vast majority, including Wesley and Luther, would be appalled that people were putting them before or like identifying with just them, especially Luther.
This is not what I
Like,
wanted.
Yeah.
And maybe even diving further into this, but I feel like it's just the words. We love labels. We love the labels in this day and age. I've tried to identify myself more as a follower of Jesus, a follower of Christ, and not
Mhm.
a Christian or not whatever, Reformed Church of America, Lutheran, Methodist. Like, I don't want to put those labels on myself. I'd rather call myself something generic like a follower of Christ, even though that could be misinterpreted some other places.
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think, just the more specific we get, the more divisions we put up. So,
Mhm.
if you keep it simple, I'm a Christian, like I follow Christ,
Mhm.
then it's a lot easier to welcome people into like talking to you about that, as opposed to you say somebody like, yeah, I'm from the Reformed Church of America.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, what? What is like?
Yeah.
Or if they know what that is, they're already judging you because they already think they know everything you
Mhm.
believe.
Mhm.
So like, you don't need to do that.
No.
Like, just start as a follower of Christ.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that's like the cool thing about the way this letter is set up is that he's got these 5 main issues, but then what he does is he talks about the issue and then he relates them each back to the gospel
Mhm.
and why the issue is a problem according to the gospel of Jesus.
Mhm.
So I think this is a really good model for us now when we encounter issues in the church to be bringing it back. Paul's ultimately always coming back to like, what does it mean to follow Jesus
Yes.
in the church? And then the next one, chapters 5 through 7 is talking about sex. And there's a couple different issues. You've got people that are having sex with prostitutes. You have apparently one guy who is sleeping with his dad's wife. And he talks about why we shouldn't do that according to Jesus. And then he goes on to food, and they are having this discrepancy about, should I eat meat that's sacrificed to idols? Should I not eat meat that's sacrificed to idols? And they're dividing there, and he kind of gives a both and answer in there, where he's like, you can do it if you're like alone and no one else is really going to know about it. But if there's someone who might be like, oh, he worships idols because he ate that idol meat,
Right.
then don't do it.
It's almost like if it's not causing a problem for other people, it's fine.
Yeah.
But as soon as you're causing issues for other people, like, you need to stop.
Number one, it's permissible, but number two, is it beneficial?
Yes.
Right. Exactly. And so he talks about that in relationship to the gospel. And then he goes on to their like church gathering, and they're having issues with speaking in tongues and prophecy, and like, how do we conduct our Sunday gatherings, as we would call them.
Mm-hmm.
And then he relates that to the gospel. And then finally, and kind of like the pinnacle of his argument, people are having issues with the resurrection in general.
Mhm.
And so he talks about why that's so central to the gospel. So I think it's cool. The church in Corinth is dividing over these 5 things. So he addresses each one and says, this is how we should look at it in light of Jesus and his story.
And that is really important into Jesus's identity. Who is Paul telling us through this structure that Jesus is? Jesus is the perfect demonstration. Paul's not saying like, here's the problem, and you know what I think about it? I think it's wrong. He's
Right.
like, look at Christ.
Yeah.
Like, emulate Christ. It's not what you're doing. These are the differences, and like logically goes
Yeah.
through how that should be.
Yeah.
So who is Jesus? He's the ultimate problem solver. As long as we look at his life and think to ourselves, cheesily, what would Jesus do?
There is like one spot where Paul even like calls it out. He's like, concerning this, I don't have a command, but I do have an opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like in almost all the ways he refers back to Jesus, but then he's like, okay, Jesus didn't necessarily talk about this or demonstrate this, but I do have an opinion,
Right.
which is like, just stay single, basically. It's-
Well, how many issues like that come up in today's day where you're
Yeah.
like, oh man,
Yeah.
let me read my Bible. Oh, it's not super clear about A, B, or C, and then like, okay, what does your heart tell you? Like, what is somebody more knowledgeable than you tell you?
Yeah. I wonder too, because Jesus had time to address all of these things. Like, there were issues then that are still issues now, and
Mhm.
he didn't. So like, I wonder how much that speaks into it too, just the fact that there are things that Jesus doesn't teach
Mhm.
that, we have to work through, but at the same time, maybe we shouldn't be spending all of our time on.
Well, and maybe if we just focus on the issues that he did talk about, maybe they would trickle down into the other issues and give us a fresher state of mind when attacking those.
Yeah.
So I think on a large scope, we've kind of just overviewed the whole letter.
Mhm.
We already have an answer, and you kind of said it, Harry, of who Jesus is. He's someone that in every aspect of our life and in every aspect of church life, we ought to be referring back to find the answer of how we live. For the Corinthians, it was specifically the leadership of the church. How do we conduct our sex life? How do we conduct our eating life?
Mm-hmm.
How do we conduct our church gatherings? And what about resurrection? And so he looks to Jesus in all of those ways. So I think that's a good model for our own areas. Like, if I have a question about my own life or about church life, where should I be looking first? And Paul just goes straight to Jesus.
Mm-hmm. And I do think it's like a couple episodes ago, you're like, when you read the book of Jonah, don't read it from God's perspective, read it from Jonah's perspective. I think I tend to read this from Paul's perspective. If Corinth is Las Vegas, like it's basically capitalist America too. So like, how many of these issues are applicable to us, as opposed to like when we're reading Thessalonians and like their experience is so far removed from what I am living right now. That's like, it's hard for me to like take a lot from that and be like, I need to apply this to my life.
Yeah.
All the issues in this are very much alive in my day and age.
Yeah.
Money, sex, food, getting along with everybody,
Yeah.
lawsuits. It's
Yeah.
like we can't agree on anything these days. We need a contract for everything,
Yeah.
and half the time it gets broken. And then we are just as broken, if not more so, as the people that he's addressing in this letter. I would like to talk about communion,
Yeah.
because he does talk about that. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, correcting an abuse of the Lord's Supper as it's labeled in the NIV. I want to talk about communion and how it seems like these people manipulated or lost sight of what communion really was.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can just go ahead and read 1 Corinthians starting at chapter 11, verse 23. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This is the cup, the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." This might start to sound familiar to some people.
Who said that?
Because this is where we get our liturgy for communion for most or many churches. So if you're ever wondering, why does the pastor say the same thing every time when we do communion? This is where it's coming from. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing, he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not judge the body rightly. So he goes on and he talks about, here's why we do communion. And he quotes Jesus in that, "This is my body, this is my blood given to you." And then he's like, and when we do it, we're supposed to do it in a self-assessment sort of way. He uses the word judgment, which I think is maybe has a new connotation in our context.
I like
that we
self-assessment,
wouldn't
self-reflection.
necessarily.
Yeah.
We just don't use that word in the same way.
Yeah, I think I see a number of different pieces of what he recommends communion to have in it. Number one, can't be like a private dinner. And I immediately, I'm like, crap, like how many times do I like sit at home and make myself like a wonderful bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich and just relish it all myself when I could easily make like 4 of them, It's hard to have the Lord's Supper without that body of believers around you. I think that that's really important. And I think, once again, we've lost sight of that in today's day and age. We have a dinner table with just enough chairs in our home for our family. It's a rarity that we eat dinner with others, let alone number 2, which I was going to go into, which is this self-reflection, this before we sit down and eat, it's all for Christ. And let's think about if we're worthy of doing this in the name of Christ. How many times a day do I do that? 0. Maybe once a month on a Sunday when I'm forced to do it, but it's something that he's saying you should be doing continuously. He doesn't say every Sunday. He doesn't say like it should be every single time.
Well, verse 34 kind of throws a wrench into that a bit too. It says, if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home so that you will not come together for judgment.
Yeah.
So like before you eat, it's so that you don't come to dinner hungry and that's all you focus on.
It sounds like that was an issue too.
So I started probably too late in the passage. So I'll back up to why this is an issue, which is chapters 11. And this also has my favorite part of the whole story, the whole letter in it. Because the NASB is awesome. So I'll start at chapter 11, verse 18. And it says, "For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. And in part, I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk." What? "Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you." So it seems like what's happening is they're having like a big banquet when they have the Lord's Supper. And some people are getting there early to the party. They eat all the food, they drink all the wine, and they're drunk.
It's like, I'm super hungry right now. I know I gotta wait, but I'm so hungry.
Right.
Where the apps?
So then the people come later and they don't have anything left for them and they're just left wanting. And so he's like, hey, if you're coming here just to eat, just do that at home first, because that's not the point.
Because you're missing the point.
And I feel like we criticize the current way of doing this tradition a lot, but in a practical sense, this is actually a really smart way to do it. You're never going to get enough to like fill your hunger, and you're doing it in a way that promotes the ritual about it above the actual food that you're eating. It makes a lot of sense. It's something we should be doing a lot more often when we eat together with people. That is taking communion together. But I mean, from a church's perspective, you're kind of subverting the whole temptation of people just coming to eat food.
From a church's perspective, I think there's some things that we do that are criticized rightly, But I think that this is something that there probably just needs to be education about it, or there just needs to be a resetting of why are we doing this? Because you're right, the system of, first of all, it's like 10:30, so it's not breakfast or lunchtime. Second of all, it's not like we're giving each person a loaf of bread because they're hungry. We're doing it for a different reason.
Yeah.
Like it is set up very well and very practically. For me, from my own perspective, like I just need to sit in the text and understand, okay, well, what's the reason behind this? Like, why did this actually start and come about, and why is it important today? I don't think a lot of people do that.
When you're together with a group of people, there's a covenant you kind of take with somebody else when you're eating with them. Like it's a very personal thing to do. And the salt covenant is kind of throughout the whole Bible. So like eating together is this very intimate kind of ritual. Yeah. Like when you break bread with somebody, it's this thing that's throughout the whole Bible. So communion is just another part of that. And it does happen on Passover. So there's a ton of layers there that we're not even going to get into with this. But eating together with other people should be a really powerful thing. But a lot of times we make it just about the food.
Well, and thinking back, I mean, who's a person in the New Testament who had a lot of dinners with a lot of people? Jesus. Like, I so wish I could have been on one of those tables, because like that would have been some real communion, dude. Yeah. Who knows what he was doing? Who knows what he was saying? Who knows how it was conducted? But at the very least, we know that that was really important to him. He was feasting with anybody who wanted to come to the table.
Yeah, and so chapter 11, the last verse of chapter 10, or last several, are actually what launch him into this, because he's been talking about the eating meat, and so we can go into that. But then starting in chapter 10, verses 31, he says, "Whatever then, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they may be saved." So that verse 31 gets quoted a lot. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. And so he launches from his last point into this one, saying when you're taking communion, like it should be to the glory of God, not to the glory of yourself.
Or your stomach.
Yeah, which they've kind of been doing, it seems like. So
we have the meats.
The point that got him into this is that people were eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And apparently some of the church was cool with that, because they're like, hey, it doesn't matter. We believe that God is the God of all things and not these idols. These idols are meaningless to us. So we're just going to eat the meat and it makes no difference. And I think a lot of us would look at that and be like, agreed. Like, if it's sacrificed to an idol, that idol has no power in my life. So it's meaningless. But then in the context where they're at, they're living in a context that has like a pantheon of gods, and you can worship all of them. And part of that was sacrificing to them and then eating the meat as like a thanks offering and a celebration. So when people from the outside were looking at them, they're like, oh, so they follow Jesus and they follow Zeus because they're eating the meat. So like, it's cool to follow Jesus and also to worship Zeus.
This one's really interesting for me to think about, because the first thing that comes to mind is, what if I participated in a Seder, in a classical Jewish communion?
You'd be totally fine to do that.
Well,
as a Christian.
So what about if I then went to India, and
so now you're getting dicey,
and posted it on Facebook, and someone was like, oh, maybe Harry believes in this. Is that bad? Like, is Paul saying that's bad? I don't really know. It's interesting how it kind of conflicts with like what we were just talking about, like share communion with everybody, like sit at the table with everybody, do it. Like, but Paul is saying, what if it leads somebody astray? And that's the part that's kind of murky for me.
Have you guys ever been to another like gathering of people? So I've been to a mosque a few times. What I was told by somebody else that would go with people that were different than them is that if you're going to ask people to believe what you believe, you need to also understand what they believe. And so like it has to be an equal playing field, right? And that's just kind of respect anyway. But what I think is cool, I see a lot of evidence of the true God in other religions. And so when I go to a mosque, I'm being very critical. I'm not believing everything they say, but they do, they talk about love and love for your brother and all these other things that I do agree with. So I went, but I didn't participate.
Well, I think there's a difference too between me taking an oxen and being like, I'm going to slay this in the name of Zeus, slaying it, cooking it, and then giving some of it to Hayden.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like let's sit down and let's bless this food in the name of all things good,
Mhm.
which we may ascribe to different entities, or maybe not, but that's how it appears. I think that there's a subtle difference between the situation that these guys were in and maybe how I'm extrapolating that to my own experience.
Yeah, I do though. I'm just thinking about my experience again. I do think it's important that people know like who you are. Like when I enter that mosque, I don't pretend to be Muslim. Like they know I'm a Christian because from the people that invited me know. Like I'm not like pretending to be something else and then going back to Christianity as soon as I leave the mosque.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that you make those things known. Like people should know who you follow.
That's interesting. Maybe, and like I think about how I would approach that situation. I'd probably come in and not like feign ignorance, but I probably wouldn't pick a side.
Yeah.
I'd probably just be like, I'm interested in learning.
Yeah.
I just.
Well, I mean, you could say, hey, it's probably good for them to know too. Hey, I'm a Christian, but I'm interested in learning about your religion.
Yeah. I don't even know if I would say that though. I'd be like, I'm just interested.
I'll see.
In it. Yeah.
But flip that,
Yeah.
I would be ecstatic if somebody came to Hope and was like, hey, I'm Muslim. I'm interested in learning about your religion. I'd be like,
sweet.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've been waiting for you to walk in these doors.
Yes. Man. Participate as much as you want. We're not going to come badger you, but just do whatever you need to do. If you have any questions, come talk to me.
And I would love to hear about what you think about this.
Yeah. I think it's okay to be in those things. Mm-hmm. It's like be in the world, not of the world, but it's okay to participate with other people that think differently than you. But, I think, you shouldn't try to change who you are in and out of the situation. I would.
And I'm admitting here that I would put on like a slight subterfuge and I'd just be like, oh yeah, I'm super interested. But at no point would I be like, I'm a follower of Christ foremost, for fear of upsetting them or whatever,
Yeah. Okay. So my situation is a little different because I was invited by Muslim people that knew I was a Christian.
They already knew, yeah.
So
I guess why would I ever be? Yeah.
Right.
Seder without them knowing.
I don't know. I just think it's good to be upfront about that stuff.
Yeah. I think where this becomes applicable in our current culture is in experimenting with religious practices. Yeah. For one particular example, the church that I work at, they do a lot of meditation in their worship services. And so I think someone could come in from the outside and potentially look at that and be like, oh, they are seeking God through this meditative practice. And having not known a lot about meditation, they could come to wrong conclusions about what we're doing, because there are different kinds of meditations and some are, in my opinion, more beneficial for others. Some are maybe more dangerous than others. And some are more tied to like other religions and other deities than these ones. Right. Like the way that the church I work at promotes meditation and doing it is like becoming aware of just the generosity and the grace of God in your life, that you're here, that you're breathing, that the air is here, that the trees are here, and that those are all gifts from God, but you could come at it from another angle. And so then the question is like, hey, if potentially meditation is going to make some people think that we're following Buddha or whatever, then maybe we shouldn't do it in a public space. Maybe we should just do that in our own time where we know what we're getting out of it. Yeah. I would have pushback if I were to say that, right. And I think that would be maybe though a place where this could fall in line with the modern context.
Yeah. But I think you're reiterating kind of what Paul is saying, right? Whether you're meditating or praying or whatever you're doing, what's the number one? It's focusing yourself on God. Number two is, okay, now that you're focused on God, now that that's the most important thing to you, how is that affecting your surroundings? How is that affecting the people that are viewing you? Is it beneficial or is it actually causing some kind of harm or dissension? I think that those are two questions that we should ask ourselves in all of these things that we're talking about. Are we pointing towards God? And then is it actually helping those around us or is it hurting?
It's not coincidence that this launches off like the previous argument that Paul was talking about, which is the gatherings at their church. And so he, in this one, he's saying, hey, don't be selfish in the way that you take communion. Don't be selfish in the way that you eat. And don't be selfish in the way that you conduct your gatherings. Because in this context, people were like just standing up and like yelling in tongues and really seeking this hyper spiritual, powerful experience. And Paul's like, hey, I've got nothing wrong with speaking in tongues. He's like, I speak in tongues, but I make sure that when I'm doing it, it's not weird,
And
first of all,
disruptive.
and disruptive. And he's like, hey, because if you're speaking in tongues and no one can understand what you're saying, like there's really no point in speaking in tongues unless you're just going to do that in private between you and God.
Right.
And then you can have that spiritual experience with him. But if you're just like disrupting everyone else with like all of a sudden breaking into Mandarin and no one can understand Mandarin,
Mhm.
then that's really not going to be helpful for anything.
Yeah. Or even more than that, just ramblings.
Yeah.
Which are incredibly distracting. But it seems like he's just saying like things we all learn when we're 5. Like think about how your actions affect other people.
Use your inside voice.
Yeah.
How about? Yeah.
How do other people feel about what you're doing?
Mhm.
That's really interesting. I would just like to bring up one more thing with the sacrifices is
Mhm.
that
Sure.
it was custom for, and some people might know this, but it was custom for Jewish people to eat the sacrifices they made to God. So this is kind of a transition where now they don't sacrifice anything anymore, right? They're
Mhm.
Christians. They don't have to do that.
Mhm.
So there's still like of the mindset though, like it's okay to eat food that's sacrificed to God. Yeah, this is probably where some of the issues coming from because they're just used to doing that.
Mhm.
But now it's like, okay, but these are sacrificed to other idols.
And so they were viewing it from their Jewish lens, where it's
Mhm.
like this sacrifice was really meaningful to our God, to our practice of being a Jew. And so if we're looking at people sacrificing in the same way to other gods, like
Right.
that seems wrong.
Yeah.
And so you could totally get where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think Jewish people like that didn't follow Christ looking in would be really confused.
Mhm.
They'd be like, oh, they're not Jewish anymore. They're Christian, but they're eating Zeus's sacrifices. Like what?
Who are these people?
Yeah, I mean, it probably would be like if there were a Church of Zeus that were prominent in the United States and they also took communion,
Mhm.
and then you like came upon some of their like bread and their
Sweet.
juice,
Yeah.
and you were just hungry,
Yep.
and so you were like, okay, don't care, Zeus isn't real, like
God
don't
still
care.
loves me. Christ still loves
Yep.
me. Yeah.
But if someone were to go in there and to see you like taking communion in the same reverence that you would do it at your own church to the Church of Zeus, then you'd be like, that's an issue.
Yeah.
And even if you weren't doing it in the same reverence, but you were like outside the temple of Zeus and someone was like, here you go. And you
Mhm.
just like took it and someone saw that and they're like, whoa.
Yeah.
you
I
know?
imagine like a guy out front of the Church of Zeus, like selling hamburgers, like giving away free hamburgers.
Yeah.
Sacrifice to cow today.
I love hamburgers so much. It's like, is Harry a Zeus follower?
Yeah. Exactly. So I think the kind of the whole point of this is whatever you do, whether eating or drinking or meditating or taking communion or like working out or whatever it is there something in that that could show people that you are not following Christ first and foremost? And if so, you might want to reevaluate the way that you're doing it, the place that you're doing it, the time that you're doing it, because either A, it actually is a problem, even just for you personally, and you probably shouldn't be doing it anyway,
Yeah.
or B, it could lead people to wrong conclusions.
Mhm.
And so in that way, you should be selfless. And even though for you, it's like a great practice that you really get a lot of benefit out of, for the sake of others, you should do it in another place.
This is a really good lesson.
It is.
That's how I view swearing too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like it does not affect me at all to do it, but I know that other people interpret that differently.
For sure.
So that is like the only reason I don't do it around other people, unless like I know people around me are comfortable with it.
Mhm.
Then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like it's really just putting yourself aside and putting other people's priorities above you.
Put a filter on,
Yeah.
and for whatever it is, Just for my own edification,
Yeah.
will you go to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20 through 22, and when he makes the exclamation, "What?" Will you tell me what the Greek word is?
Yeah, I do want
Yeah.
to know. Yeah, I don't think it shows up in the NIV, but it's verse 22. It's the first word in the NASB.
It's May.
What,
May.
what does it mean?
It means not actually. So it's like it's just a general explanation.
So then, you do this.
Not?
Not.
It's like not or don't or It's like a negative exclamation.
That's what it is. Like,
Which
it's
actually,
like,
what's pretty good because it's like everything I just said. Like,
what?
you're crazy.
Yeah,
He
no.
takes his own supper. He's hungry, and the other is drunk.
Nah.
That's the first not joke.
Psych.
I like that a lot. Thank you for that, by the way.
That's hilarious, dude. That is so funny. Yeah, that's like my favorite part of this whole letter is his.
It's not what? It's not in the NIV. They took it out.
So it says this word is a negative of will, wish, or doubt. And what is a pretty good? Not's pretty good, but we don't really have a
Not.
not.
Okay, on to the next one. Let's talk about sex, shall we?
Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about sex.
baby.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about you and me.
Oh, you're singing an actual song.
Yeah, that's an actual song.
Oops.
You didn't know that?
Nope.
Copyright.
Something that Paul talks about a lot, which is sexual immorality.
Mm-hmm.
That's a large topic that we could talk about. But in
Yeah.
this particular case, there has been actually reported specific types of sexual immorality.
Yeah. And the word he's using here is the word he's going to use a lot, which is porneia,
Mhm.
which is where we get pornography from. And it is kind of a general term. Sexual immorality is a good way to say it. It's just doing things that are deviant of what you should be doing sexually.
So, I mean, it starts out with that situation we mentioned earlier, verse 1 of chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind as does not even exist among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. You have become arrogant and have not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. There are two things going on here. One, there's a church member who, quote, has his father's wife. So not good. But then his real problem, like if that was the only problem, he would have probably just addressed that personally to that person. But the real issue is that the church didn't respond in the right way. The way he says it is that they've become arrogant instead of mourning. So it's almost as though they're celebrating this practice rather than being hurt by
In
it.
mine, it says, "You are proud.
Yeah.
You are proud
Yeah.
of this."
What I get from this is that this came up as a problem and the church kind of elevated itself to say, we're going to say that's fine. Maybe not even glorify it. Just be like, we're just going to say, it's
Oh,
fine. Don't
I-
worry about it.
I have a perfect comparison.
Yeah.
Once again, reading my George Washington biography, after the Revolution, it was like fashionable to talk about human rights and to talk about the emancipation of slaves. Everyone was like, oh, it's just such a terrible thing. And literally nobody ever, like a few people did, but like George Washington himself didn't emancipate any of his slaves until the end of his life because it was tied to his money. It was tied to his whole living. So, I mean, there's so many things that's like, we can talk a big game, about how this is bad or this is bad, but when we're actually going to, put our pedal to the metal, are we going to do it or not?
Yeah, and I think maybe with these people, they might know in their hearts that it's bad, but they're not even saying that it's bad.
Mhm.
They're like outright saying like it's fine because they've elevated themselves. They're arrogant. They think they know better than God, which is what that arrogance is from. Yeah, instead of mourning, which would be obviously being distraught by what this guy's doing
Mhm.
and probably kicking him out, but also trying to help him. Maybe not kicking him out of the church, but saying, hey, like, this is a terrible, terrible thing. Like, we
Well-
need to figure this out.
So let me talk about that.
Mhm.
Paul is pretty judgmental on how to deal with these people. At the end, he says you shouldn't even eat with these people. So
Yeah.
we were just talking about Jesus eating with prostitutes and
Yeah.
whatnot. And here Paul's like, I don't want you to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all. Don't even eat with them.
Yeah, but he qualifies it later in verse 9, and he says, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or the swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world.
Right.
But actually, I wrote that you would not associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person.
Yeah.
So they're saying the same thing that Paul's saying the same thing that Jesus said when we've talked about in I think it was our forgiveness podcast, where it's like, hey, I'm not saying don't associate with bad people. If you were to do that, you'd have to become a monk in a sanctuary living by yourself.
Or be dead.
Yeah, and he's like, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying Christians who are promoting bad morality.
Mhm.
And then he references Jesus in saying, don't you know a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? And he's like, if you keep someone in your church that is promoting this and you don't address it, you just allow it to permeate, then it's going to permeate and your whole church is going to have some issues.
Yeah.
That's a pretty practical lesson too, because I think that churches can talk a big game when it comes to, well, I mean, I won't even say churches. I can talk a big game as far as like, you know, making myself a better person, this and this and that. But like, if I'm not actually going to do it, like, what's the point of going to church? Like, what's the point of representing something that is not true?
Yeah. I really like this point of view because I think it addresses a lot of things that the church does wrong, which is imposing our morals on people that don't believe in our Christ. Like, church does that all the time.
Yeah.
You should definitely, like, not participate in this thing. Like, this thing that I'm going to say premarital sex right now. Definitely don't do that. It's a terrible thing to do. But the person isn't a Christian. They've never subscribed to being a Christian. It's legal for them to do this.
Yep.
Like, it doesn't make any sense for us to try to do that. Like, the very first thing you should try to do is introduce them to Jesus. And if they decide they want to follow this Jesus person, then you can try to introduce them to everything else.
Yeah.
The church does this all the time. And Paul's saying, no, like, you can still be friends with those people. You can still hang out with them.
Well,
But if they're in the church saying they follow Christ and then they're disregarding everything he teaches, like, you shouldn't associate yourself with those people.
and I'll give those really judgmental people a little bit of slack, because I mean, I just 10 minutes ago was reading this and I'm like, he says that we shouldn't associate with sexually immoral people. It's like, screw them, don't even eat with them. And like, a lot of people read so many different pieces of the Bible like that. And they're like, ultimatum, here we go. Like, let's build a religion around it.
Yeah.
And you're right. Like, that's not what the point is. It's not what the point is. We shouldn't be judgmental. We shouldn't damn people for whatever it is that they've done. First and foremost, we should introduce them to Christ and try to steer their life towards him.
Yeah, and if people want to follow Christ, then it's our duty to say, hey, this is how you do it, you know, and tell them when they're doing it wrong and then help them up when, you know, they need help. But I think we put the cart ahead of the horse a lot in this and trying to fix people before they even know Jesus.
Yeah. We get upset with what Paul is saying without ever getting to verse 9.
Yeah.
And that's where he makes it very clear, like, hey, I'm not talking about just people in general. I'm talking about Christian people. And I think it's pretty clear that he's putting this all in the context of what Jesus said, which, like I said, we've talked about, where it's like, hey, confront the person one-on-one. If they're not listening, talk to them with another person, then get some more people to talk with them. And by the time you've got the whole church that is like saying, hey, this is a problem, and they still don't think it's a problem, then you treat them like tax collectors, and which means you don't just say goodbye, we hate you.
Disassociate.
You still are like loving them in the same way that Jesus loved tax collectors, but you just don't really view them as a part of your Christian
or hold them to the Christian standard.
Right, you don't hold them to that. And so I think it's interesting too, the way that Paul he does get pretty judgmental on this part in verse 3, but he does it in a really interesting way. He says, for I, on my part, though absent in my body, but present in spirit, have already judged him who has committed this, as though I were present. In the name of our Lord Jesus, when you were assembled, and I with you in spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. So Paul's like, what this guy is doing is wrong. And if he's going to continue to boast about this, I'm going to deliver him over to that, not so that he can be damned, but so that he can be saved. So I think that's really interesting.
We don't have to get into it.
Yeah.
But I'd like to go to homosexuality.
Sure.
As well as marriage next. So, I mean, that could be like a whole 10 podcast series or whatever, but, and I don't think any of us are homosexual at this table, so maybe we're not super qualified to be able to talk about it.
I mean, if we want to talk about that, we can go to the passage. Where are you at?
1 Corinthians 6.
My assumption of this conversation was that it was at least going to be 2 hours. So let's break it up right here.
Okay.
We'll come back. Shout out to Canyon Coffee for the delicious coffee we've been drinking today. If you've been watching our videos, then you see it, but if you've only been listening to the audio, then you don't know that we are run on Canyon Coffee Roasters. And also the music that you hear is from Clink Tracks and also John Jones Project. So thanks to you all for making awesome music that we can share.
Yeah.